This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's been 1 year since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, killing 1,200 people. In the ensuing war, more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and there are mounting concerns about a wider conflict in the region. Now, Gaza is facing a humanitarian crisis. In July, the United Nations reported that the humanitarian support systems in the region were nearing total collapse. Aid workers report that their efforts to bring civilians food, water, health services, and medication have been stymied by Israeli forces. Since then, the situation has worsened. In September, the UN's senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza addressed the ongoing situation.
Time is slipping away as a man-made humanitarian crisis has turned Gaza into the abyss.
This hour, we're looking at humanitarian aid efforts in the region. And joining me now is Yanti Shripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children, which is a humanitarian aid organization based here in Connecticut. Hi, Yanti. Welcome back to Where We Live.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you for having me back.
And also with us is Lila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist. Lila's journalism focuses on extremism, human rights, and immigration. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lila.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, you can join the conversation as well. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Lila, I want to start this conversation with you. It's been 1 year of war in the region. Could you give our listeners an idea or an overview of what the conditions are like in Gaza right now?
I really cannot stress enough that the conditions in Gaza are rapidly turning towards the worst with every passing day and hour. That critical medication, and communications aren't reestablished with people in Gaza. So my focus over the last year has been on the conditions in which journalists report on, and they are existing within the same conditions that every other civilian in Gaza is also facing, in that they've been displaced at this point multiple times with worsening infrastructure every single time. And that's to say that the roads are no longer, the electricity and ability to access clean and hygienic water is also something that's become a rarity. And that when they are displaced from place to place, it's essentially saying that they're displaced from tent to tent or homelessness to homelessness, because as debris collects, the only way for them to actually form shelter, if they don't already have somewhere else to go, is through makeshift homes. So that's also to say that we've passed now 4 different seasons in Gaza since it's been a year, and they've experienced terrible flooding in the tents that they've worked in. If they have a car, they're incredibly lucky. They've faced cold, they've faced incredible heat, and all throughout they're facing starvation because of the man-made famine that Israel has imposed on the Gaza Strip. So I could go on for another 5-10 minutes and tell you about all of the details in which they're experiencing it, and it still wouldn't capture the deteriorated levels of living that they are living in.
And based on what you just shared with us, conditions have changed significantly since the war started?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the longer that food and nutrition is withheld, the more fatigued and the more tired people become, the more that they're displaced. The same thing applies, when they haven't had adequate nutrition levels. There's also something to say about the mental health and the distress in which people are living in, watching their loved ones and their neighbors, their entire neighborhoods get destroyed along the way. The will to actually survive is something that's unfortunately something that people have to deal with. And so when I mean that the conditions have changed, I don't mean that, there's a situation that today that exists that didn't exist yesterday. No,
Right.
It's compounded upon one another. It's something that they're existing with simultaneously.
And can you also talk about why is it so difficult for people in Gaza to leave the region?
Well, so since 2006, Israel has actually controlled land, air, land, sea, and air borders of Gaza. People aren't actually able to exit Gaza without Israel's permission. And Gaza doesn't have a functioning airport, nor does it have full control over its border with Egypt. So those that have been able to leave have left only with the permission of Israel, and those that have been able to evacuate have done so because they've paid $5,000 per person to exit at the Rafah border, at the border of Egypt. But that even is an option that no longer really exists since Israel bombed it, and since it's become even more treacherous to cross. So while people were able to escape, having paid $25,000 if they were two parents and two children, that's not really even an option anymore. And that's also assuming that people were able to obtain that amount of money at all. So yeah, that's part of the reason why people aren't really able to escape.
And Yanti, you came on the show roughly a year ago to talk about how difficult it was to bring in humanitarian aid then. Can you tell me more about how blockades and barriers are continuing to impact that aid now?
Yeah, sure. Look, Catherine, it's been, a year of essentially the adults failing children, right? Left, right, and center, everywhere. Children in Israel as well as children
Right.
in Gaza and now in the wider region. And when we spoke, it was really getting bad. Then I was there in March. I was able to get into Gaza, and I thought it was horrible. And every time I spoke to somebody, I said, "Well, I can't believe it can get any worse." And every time it got worse. So where we are now, 12 months out, is that actually access is even worse than it was in March or when we last spoke. So we've really seen aid, again, trickle down to literally a trickle. With the Rafah border closing, none of the available land routes have been open at any given point over these last 12 months simultaneously and at full capacity. Right? So even if there is an opening, whether it's Kerem Shalom, whether it's Erez in the north or any other, it's always been sometimes temporarily, never a full sort of 24/7 approach to opening it up. So it's really slowed down to a trickle. And aside from measuring, incoming trucks, being our ability to distribute supplies and, basic services to children inside Gaza is also incredibly constrained. It's very difficult for us to, for instance, to travel to or even send supplies into the north of Gaza. When I was there, we were operating out of Rafah, where we had at least some level of a base, and at the time, that's where most of the people were. So you were able to do at least something within a small area of operation. Now, our own staff had to again be displaced and had to move up to Deir al-Balah, where we've now opened a primary health clinic. And that's an interesting sort of data point when they told me when we opened it. I think 60% of the people who came to that clinic every day had to walk an hour. So that tells you something about the lack of access to primary healthcare. This is not even a fully functioning hospital, right? Because the majority of those have been completely damaged. But that tells you something about the lack of access to essentially primary healthcare services in Gaza. And then what Lila said about education and mental health. When I was there, I was talking to this mom who was, again, I think she was 3-4 times displaced, end of March, mind you. And they were in this tent on the beach of Deir al-Balah. We're not talking fancy tents, right? There's a piece of tarp and some wooden sticks because there's very little material inside of Gaza. They were sharing one toilet with 600 people in that community. We were talking about all these issues, the lack of food, the lack of clean water, etc. Kids had no shoes. But then she said to me, and I'll never forget it, she said, but what I actually need the most is mental health support. So there's this woman who lacks a lot of things, and she sort of recognizes, and she said, when I look at my children, they're so traumatized, I would prioritize mental health support over food security.
And that's certainly an element that we really focused on the last time we had this conversation, is because realizing that all infrastructure is either damaged, in the process of being damaged, or no longer accessible, as you say, Yanti. And can you also talk about with children too, lack of mental health support, lack of education? I mean, I imagine not having the usual safe classrooms to go to is a huge impact. Can you talk about how that can really, impact the children and their parents, really.
Yeah, it's massive. And we, Save the Children always says this in any given crisis, right? Education needs to be prioritized because education is life-saving. Now, that is sometimes a discussion with people when they say, well, surely clean water, food, shelter, etc. And we always go back to first principles to say, but we're not talking even, structured classrooms and the importance for children to learn their multiplication tables or anything. This is about giving kids a sense of normalcy, to be in a space with their classmates, with their peers, to play, most and foremost, to play and be children. And it also allows us then an opportunity to bring in some counseling, some trauma experts, depending on the type of trauma. And for parents, it is a wonderful opportunity to actually know that their children are safe and are children again, so that they can also focus on what it is they need to do given their situation. So, child-friendly spaces that we run are not there to completely replace a school as such, but it does give children a huge opportunity even if for a short while, to be children again.
And this is something
that is hard to do today as well. We're running a number of these child-friendly spaces inside of Gaza, but as you can imagine, if there's no guarantee of safety or deconfliction of those places, we sometimes hesitate to bring children together because we don't want to put them at even more risk.
And we'll certainly come back to that, digging a little deeper later on in the conversation. But I also want to bring up in the last few days and weeks, Israel's forces have also launched attacks on Lebanon. Can you give our listeners an update on what we're seeing there?
For me or for Lila?
For you, Yanti, in terms of in terms of humanitarian aid, what are you seeing? What are the conversations you're having? I'm assuming there's some echoes.
Again, and here we were sort of not preparing for exactly this level of scale, but it wasn't completely unexpected either. Look, again, we've been in Lebanon since 1953. We have about 200 people there. All of our staff are still safe and accounted for. We're operating in 95 of the shelters where people are displaced, and we're doing the basics. We're handing out water. We're trying to get kids to play together in that space. So we bring some child protection experts. We bring early education experts. We're doing the logistics of seeing if people need shelter and food or water. But that is it. What we can do now. Look, we're proud of what we've done so far. We were prepared. We rolled it out the moment it was needed. But again, we're concerned about continued access, continued safety of our own staff as well, and clearly concerned about how much further this can go. We're also seeing, about 300,000 people, I think, have now gone back to or gone into Syria. And again, they're, of course, already an under-resourced, constrained environment where our teams now have to see what they can do to help those refugees to deal with the sort of immediate impact of this displacement.
I also want to talk about the impact with aid workers as well, but I also wanted to ask, talk about being on the ground in Israel as well. What kind of humanitarian aid is needed there? I'm assuming similar?
In Gaza or in
Israel?
Lebanon?
In Israel.
In the north, or
are there also humanitarian aid needed in Israel as well?
Oh, absolutely. Look, 100,000 people, I think, if not more, were displaced from the north of Israel for the last 11 months. So there's definitely displacement inside Israel. There's been, of course, the horror of the October the 7th. Children there are also traumatized. Your area doesn't have to be hit by a rocket to be traumatized by rockets flying over. So that ever-present, threat of conflict, of hearing conflict, of seeing conflict on the news, of hearing I'm sure your community talk about it, has a huge impact on children's mental health.
And Lila, we've been talking about the impacts on both the civilians, the people, and the humanitarian aid workers as well. And it sounds like access for those workers is continuing to be restricted very significantly. Can you talk about how the general conditions in Gaza are also impacting reporters in the region?
Yeah, well, everything we've discussed so far also affects journalists in Gaza. They are considered civilians. They don't have any sort of protected status. In fact, they've come under targeting by the Israeli military quite a bit, both in intimidation tactics and in actual, substantiations that them and their families have actually been targeted. So this is all to say that in addition to facing displacement, in addition to facing famine, in addition to facing the risk of diseases, in addition to also facing what other civilians are facing in that their family members are also being killed and they are witnessing extraordinary loss and experiencing extraordinary grief on top of being able to actually report. And so something else that they're experiencing that's beyond the average civilian is that they're covering all of these events. They're trekking from place to place to count how many dead there are, to document the level of destruction that they've witnessed across neighborhoods in any one place. As people have been arrested, they cover the people's returns in their terrible conditions. They are facing incredible duress by all that they are witnessing while experiencing it themselves. Something that they're also doing because there has been a communications blackout and because there is, very poor access to internet, very poor access to electricity. Not all of them are equipped with satellite phones. Not all of them are able to charge all of their material all of their equipment on the regular to stay in touch that way. Is that they're actually going by foot from place to place. So something that they would have been able to learn prior would have taken maybe 5 minutes if they had gotten on the phone or received a text back. But now, in order to really understand whatever happened in any which airstrike or in whatever development or as a result of displacement, they have to find out themselves. So you can imagine that's 4 or 5 hours sometimes on something that would have taken 5 minutes before on foot over destructed land while they're exhausted, while they also are sharing a toilet with I don't know how many other 100 people. Another aspect to consider is that they're living in the same places that they're reporting on. So they're also taking shelter in schools. They're taking shelter in whatever hospitals are destroyed or damaged or still stand. And they're also displaced themselves. And on top of all of that, they might have already lost family. And so you can imagine they're witnessing what they're covering for their people, that they're also experiencing themselves while their bodies are completely worn down. I really, I don't know how to describe the level of misery that they experience on the day to day and how much distress and mental strength they have to call on to be able to do this kind of work while also suffering a lot of damage to their mental health.
We'll be continuing this conversation with Laila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist, and also Yanti Shripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children. And next, we'll also be joined by Nathaniel Raymond, who is the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health, to talk about the laws and safeguards surrounding war. Connecticut Public has been covering the Israel-Hamas war from all different angles. To see all of our coverage, visit ctpublic.org. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're talking about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And joining me now is Nathaniel Raymond, who's the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. Nathaniel, welcome back to Where We Live.
Thank you for having me.
And also with us is Yanti Shripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children, and Laila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist. So Nathaniel, I want to jump straight to you to talk about the laws that we have surrounding what is and is not allowed during times of armed conflict. So I want to talk about the principles of international humanitarian law. And I believe the first principle is distinction, right, Nathaniel? And can you tell us what does that mean?
That's correct. Underneath the Geneva Conventions, which is really the bedrock instrument of what we call international humanitarian law, which governs really how we define the laws of armed conflict. The principle of distinction means that all parties to a conflict have to distinguish between those who are party to the conflict and those who are what's called hors de combat in French, which means removed from battle or not party to conflict. And certain types of personnel start as hors de combat, and that would be civilians, aid workers, and those who are not participating in hostilities. But when people who have been participating in the facilities are wounded, they are then removed from battle. But conversely, those who start with protected status can lose it. Hospitals start with protected status, schools, critical infrastructure, and events can occur in war that degrade that status. But in the beginning, we start with a clear distinction between civilians and armed actors.
And the next principle is called proportionality. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, the way I explain it in the classroom simply is that if you punch me in the arm, I can't hit you with a baseball bat. Proportionality means that you have to use military means that are proportionate to the necessity of the target. And so when we look at 1,000-pound bombs, in certain cases, they're being used to attack an individual in places like displaced persons camps, et cetera. The question we have to ask is, was that a proportionate use of force against the target given the setting? And so proportionality is critical because it means you can't just use whatever weapon system. It has to be proportionate to the target and to the context.
And you mentioned necessity earlier too, which is actually the third principle.
Yes, which means that there has to be a military objective when force is used. And the laws of war exist not so that civilians don't die per se. It is so that the force that is being used is to specific military objectives. And when we see these principles in play, you begin to see that they're clearly interconnected. If we can't distinguish between civilians and armed actors, we can't assess proportionality, we can't assess necessity.
And we've been talking about the principles of international humanitarian law, touching on distinction is first, proportionality, necessity. Can you tell us what the fourth principle is?
Well, there's a few contenders for the fourth principle, but the one I want to offer this morning is really what's called precaution.
Sure.
And precaution covers a bunch of aspects of the laws of armed conflict. And really what that means is that armed actors must take care to prevent civilian harm. And so when we look at the situation in Gaza, we have to be really asking critical questions about whether the precaution principle is being respected by all sides. And precaution is, I'll give you a specific example. It means that in the case of there have been attacks on hospitals. Hospitals as special protected status is one of the most specially protected objects in war, requires extra precaution. If a military actor were to hit a hospital, they can't just go and attack it if they think it's been militarized. They have to make sure that all patients have been evacuated. They have to inform those that they are going to attack, that they will attack that hospital. And then they have to give a time frame for patients to be safely evacuated and for that hospital to lose its protected status. And that's a really extreme example of precaution, but a critical one. And when precaution doesn't exist on the battlefield, it pretty much looks like what we're seeing in Gaza right now.
And Yanti, I'm kind of seeing you nodding your head a little bit with what Nathaniel's been explaining, and I think it's pretty amazing that all of that really connects back to the work that you do. But can you talk about that connection? You know, how does it connect back to what Save the Children does and what your colleagues do on the ground?
Yeah, and look, the law and the Geneva Conventions in particular, they're there to have, even in war, there are rules, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what, also as humanitarians, you feel that you can operate in war zones like this one because there are those rules. And because if we are treating patients in a hospital, if we work with children in a particular school setting, you you sort of count on those protections to be in place, or that precaution to be taken. If we give coordinates of our distribution, or we say, here we're doing this child-friendly space in this particular place, and we send coordinates, we want to feel that that precaution is taken so that those spaces are protected. So that is how it has real life impact on practical, literally really practical action on the ground.
And with those protected spaces too, can you talk specifically about children's rights during times of armed conflict? What does that look like?
Yeah, and look, conflict or any crisis, children's rights, Save the Children's founder, Eglantine Jebb, was the first one in 1919 who came up with the idea that it would be a good idea to have specific rights for children.
Right.
And then actually, ironically, this month it's been 100 years that those rights were actually enshrined. And we're sort of, poignantly celebrating that, or memorializing that, because it's clearly so obvious that those rights are trampled on still in many, many places in the world, not just in Gaza. So there, children in situations like this are always most vulnerable, as we see played out. They make up a disproportionate number of the death and the injured and the maimed. There's over, I think UNICEF projects or estimates that there's more than 1,000 children who've lost one or two limbs, which is an extraordinarily high number for any conflict, right? We haven't seen that in any other conflict, not even in Ukraine. So children are more vulnerable because they have physically, they're clearly less able to withstand. We have sent in experts now it's a grim topic, to really help surgeons in Gaza when they can treat children with, we call them pediatric blast injuries. So blast injuries, bomb shelling, even collapsing buildings on children have a much higher, they're much more likely to die from those injuries if you don't take care, specifically if there is access to basic healthcare, if you don't treat, with some specialty. So it is important that those rights for children are enshrined and held up, and clearly that is problematic. Children are more likely to lose, of course, their families, their parents in a situation like this. They're more likely to be essentially unaccompanied whilst they're still very young. And again, to really make sure that they're not completely lost in the chaos or get taken advantage of, which you also see, of course, in many cases. So again, specific caution for those things, which is why organizations like Save the Children and UNICEF and others have such a specific focus on children.
Mm-hmm. And Lila, we've been talking about sort of the specificity of certain laws in place for very specific rights. Do we have laws in place like international humanitarian law to protect members of the press?
Unfortunately, we don't. This is an honor code system across the world in that press need to be recognized as press. However, press identifying themselves in Gaza has proven to be something quite deadly for the journalists that have been working there. There are many instances in which journalists have been threatened, their families have been threatened, in that they've received phone calls from the Israeli military threatening that they have their location, they know where they are. And many journalists have reported and even posted pictures on social media, videos, lives, indicating that they've witnessed Israeli drones hovering over them, where they felt very much as though they were being watched. In Israeli media, there have been admissions of intelligence indicating that they're aware of who their airstrikes are hitting and whether or not press are among them. One of the most infamous cases is that of Al Jazeera's bureau chief, Wael al-Dahdouh, his family. There was an admission that they had known that they had killed his family when they had killed his family. So there are many instances in which the press have felt more endangered for doing their jobs for them and their families. Actually, just yesterday, there was a journalist who was 20 years old that was hit in an Israeli airstrike. His name was Hassan Hamad, and his body was actually reduced to just parts. And in order for them to collect his body parts, they had actually placed him, the people around him had placed his body parts in plastic bags in order to transport them from one place to the other. And I think I've mentioned this earlier, but I would love to stress it again and to say that the journalists are witnessing what they're experiencing, they're covering what they're experiencing, and they're also dying the most brutal of deaths. Ismail al-Ghul, a few months ago, who was also a very prominent journalist, also 27 years old. I'd like to emphasize that the majority of people in Gaza are young people. They're not adults, and the majority of people in Gaza are actually children. So the journalists we're talking about are children themselves or young adults themselves, that are dying these terrible deaths. But so Ismail al-Ghul was 27 years old. He and another camera person, Ismail al-Rifi for Al Jazeera, were traveling in a convoy to go cover an airstrike when their convoy was struck. Their car was struck, and it was struck so brutally that actually Ismail al-Ghul's head was decapitated from his body. And so the nearby people that saved their body parts in order to give them somewhat of a burial had to collect his head from off of the ground. I really cannot describe to you how any sense of morality when it comes to protecting freedom of the press in Gaza has been abandoned and discarded. It's not just that journalists aren't able to perform their jobs because they've been stripped of all of their equipment and abilities, communications, internet. It's also that they're being targeted, it's that their family is being targeted, and that when they are killed in the most gruesome of ways, so that as if it's to send a message to other journalists that this might be their fate should they continue their work.
And I just wanted to point out too that Lila is referencing something reported by the RSF, which is the Reporters Sans Frontiers. And the RSF says that among the more than 130 media workers and journalists who have been killed, they have found 31 credible cases with enough information to confirm that the journalists were targeted due to their profession. And before we go to break, I do want to follow up with Yanti real quick, because you also work with reporters on the ground as well. What are you seeing when you're working with them?
Yeah, but pretty much when I was there, I certainly met some of the local reporters that are still trying to do their work in Gaza, and they operate under exactly the circumstances Lila is describing. And it's very hard for international journalists to get in. I don't think any has been able to get access or authorization to come in. So that again makes it harder to actually report on those things from the ground, certainly for the mainstream media. And maybe back to protections, humanitarian workers are formally protected under international humanitarian law. And we clearly signpost that, our cars, our vests, everything. And yet again, this conflict is also the most deadly for humanitarian aid workers, who are mostly Gazans, who had been working and living in Gaza for a very long time. Most of our staff was with us for many, many years before this latest conflict kicked off. We've lost so far only, as she said, one of our colleagues in December with his whole family, 4 young children, and his wife, again, young people. Just to give you a sense, we knew their house was struck. They found the bodies of the family. We were only able to retrieve his body 2 weeks after that, because the amount of debris, the amount of rubble that is there makes it also incredibly hard to actually get people out, get bodies out, and further identify or confirm the count of the numbers of people killed and injured.
Well, thank you so much for that, Yanti. You've been listening to Yanti Shripto with Save the Children, also Lila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist. And we'll also be back with Nathaniel Raymond with Yale. And Connecticut Public has been covering the Israel-Hamas war from all different angles. So if you want to check out all of our coverage, please visit ctpublic.org. And coming up, we're going to take a look at the public health concerns in the Gaza region. And also a quick reminder for our listeners that we are having our Fall Pledge Drive. Consider supporting Where We Live and all of your favorite programming with a donation. And you can also do that by visiting ctpublic.org/donate. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. It's been a year since the start of the Israel-Hamas war and the ensuing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Earlier this hour, we heard about humanitarian aid efforts in Gaza, and now we'll hear about how worsening conditions can leave communities vulnerable to a public health crisis. And we're speaking to Nathaniel Raymond, who's the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. And also still with us is Yanti Shripto from Save the Children and Laila Hassan, who's been covering the conditions. Nathaniel, I want to jump straight to you. How has everything we've discussed so far sort of lead to a potential public health crisis?
It's not potential. The public health crisis is every day. And you have to understand, we're talking about an area in Gaza which is the size of 26 central parks. It's the size of Clark County in Las Vegas, with over 2 million people, with a population density of Hong Kong in an area the size of Las Vegas. And so the public health crisis really divides into four areas, and it's happening every day. One is first and foremost is starvation. In some cases, we have conditions that we call in the humanitarian field integrated phase classification 5. That's famine. And that means we have kids with severe acute malnutrition who we use something called a MUAC, a mid-upper arm circumference strip, to measure wasting. Those children are wasting like you would see in the 1984 Ethiopia famine that we remember from We Are the World. So that's when you have that level of severe acute malnutrition, especially amongst children, that's problem number one from a public health perspective. Problem number two is we have serious infectious disease, waterborne illness, respiratory illness, and people are in very close conditions with very little quality potable water. And so then you have the third issue, which is chronic conditions before the war started that are not being cared for. And that's things like hypertension, diabetes, cancer. And so you have those chronic conditions in this type of free fire zone, and those are going to turn into serious public health problems. And the fourth and final issue is that the health system itself has been dismantled. Going back to what Yanti was saying about child amputees, to manage a child amputee case in the United States, for example, and you've got to remember they're extremely complex cases because kids grow.
Right.
And you have to be redoing these surgeries constantly, redoing prosthetics, et cetera, even in the best of conditions. That is a hard care journey for a public health system to have kids like that. Okay, well, in the case of Gaza, the hospitals and the health workers in them have been systematically hit. And so you have a public health crisis anytime you have a public health system that has been basically decimated by the fighting itself. And that's where we are in Gaza. And there's no getting around it. It's two public health crises basically wrapped together. One is the consequences of the war, and the second is the consequences of the war on the health system. Over.
And really quickly here, would you consider, Nathaniel, mental health as part of this public health crisis as well?
Absolutely. My dear late colleague, Dr. Iyad El-Sarraj, who was a psychiatrist, child psychiatrist in Gaza, and a real hero in advocating for mental health for Palestinian children, really problematized that even in the pre-war period, the level of mental health impacts in Gaza and West Bank for Palestinian children were already clinically documented as being off the charts. Okay, now look at a year of constant bombardment and the traumatization of children seeing their family members die around them. And so, but this is the struggle, as Yanti and colleagues from Save the Children know so well, is you have to triage and prioritize what you are going to provide. How do you do psychosocial support when you can't bring in food? How do you do that? The answer is you don't.
And Lila, I only got about a minute here left, but I do want to ask you about the mental health state of reporters in Gaza right now. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing that while reporting is the one thing that's keeping them going from one day to the next, it's also what's causing them incredible distress and making them question whether their work has any meaning at all. I think what distresses them the most is when they feel that they're doing all of this work, putting themselves in harm's way, watching essentially everything that they know get destroyed around them and not see a world response, not see world outrage, and to continue to go online whenever they have access to eSIMs or other internet and recognize that the world is not hearing their message, is not watching them, is not giving them due dignity that they deserve, and that there is no global outrage towards what's happening to colleagues in Gaza.
And Yanti, about 30 seconds. Any final thoughts for our listeners from our conversation today?
Look, we've been saying it for 12 months, but we have to continue to say it because we don't have it yet. The only way to safeguard children and civilians in Gaza is a ceasefire and safe and unfettered access and a flooding of humanitarian aid and supplies into Gaza to deal with the immediate as well as then with a rebuild over the coming years. But that is still the call to action, and it sounds trite to say it again and again. But that ultimately will sustainably help.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. You've been listening to Yanti Shripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children. Thank you so much for coming back to Where We Live to help us understand the situation better.
Thank you for having me.
You are also listening to Lila Hassan, who's an independent investigative journalist. Thank you so much, Lila, for sharing your story with us today as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
And you are also listening to Nathaniel Raymond, who's the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health. Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for being back with us as well.
Thank you for keeping this conversation going.
Connecticut Public has been covering the Israel-Hamas war from all different angles. So if you want to check out more of our coverage, please visit ctpublic.org. And it's our annual Fall Fund Drive. Consider supporting all of your favorite programming with a donation. And you're going to hear a little bit more of how to do that from two of my colleagues. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Jean Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.